This has bad idea written all over it. Alright, for those of you just joining us, I am back here within the Crew 2, taking part in a rather bizarre challenge presented to me by Madeline. Do you see that van driving in front of us? We are going to follow it. Our goal is to see not only where it goes, but how it gets there. Why are we doing this, you may ask? It is because the Crew 2, despite being a bit of a mid-tier racing platform, is also an entire in-game world. There is lore, there is aesthetic. I would even go as far as to say there is vibes. The thing which tends to set racing games apart from other genres is how grounded within a singular experience they are. You drive in racing games because you love driving in real life, so these games are meant to be infinitely replayable, right? After you've crossed that final finish line and having received your glorious trophy, or in some cases, that coveted pink slip, there is always the inevitable question of what comes next for this champion racer. That said, the post-game of racing games does have a tendency to be rather hit or miss. Most have linear single-player storylines which task the player with defeating a certain group of people while gradually improving their arsenal of vehicles. This is regardless of if a game is open world or not, because open world games tend to gatekeep you from certain areas and events until you have completed the necessary story missions. But eventually, you will defeat the last combatant standing in your way, making yourself the greatest racer of them all. At least, where the single-player career is concerned. How then are you meant to occupy your time after the credits have rolled? For brevity's sake, we are going to limit our exploration into this topic to the more popular racing games of the last 25 years. What better place to start than with the Need for Speed series? The first two Underground games were rather limited to street racing only, and once you had unlocked everything in the game, you would spend the rest of your playthrough making custom car builds and racing them to achieve record times, for bragging rights, if for nothing else. The original Underground had you re-racing on closed tracks, but Underground 2 did let you free roam for the first time around the city of Bayview. The movement into the Most Wanted and Carbon era reintroduced police into the formula, something that had been missing since Hot Pursuit 2. The addition of police, as well as the inclusion of a challenge mode, meant that your post-game would likely be spent causing as much damage to the state as humanly possible, without getting your custom car permanently impounded. Pro Street was a different kind of Need for Speed, focusing more on sanctioned racing and official tournaments. After becoming the Street King, your next step would be taking on the world in the global leaderboards. This made it similar to other games that we'll be getting to in just a moment. Moving right along, Undercover and The Run were just more of Most Wanted. Shift and Shift 2 were just more of Pro Street, and Hot Pursuit 2010 was, well, an attempt at being Cops and Robbers, the MMO, a shortcoming which would contaminate Most Wanted's spiritual successor, which we don't talk about, before finally being corrected in Need for Speed Rivals. So, to summarize how things were up until the 2015 reboot, Need for Speed was essentially the place to be for car customization, police pursuits, and the occasional pro racing leaderboard climb. And speaking of pro racing, our next topic is going to be exactly that. Racing game critics the world over would agree that the most popular pro racing game series is that of Gran Turismo, a long-running series exclusive to the Sony PlayStation. We've never played it, sadly to say, but it's not so hard to find what's so good about it. In the world of Gran Turismo, there is only one— Whoa, hold up a second. Does he know? I think he knows. Alright, play it cool, act like you're supposed to be here. I think we're good now, but that was too close. Alright, where was I? Oh yeah. In the world of Gran Turismo, there is only one goal: become a real racing driver. Sony is famous for partnering with real-world car manufacturers and real-world racing teams to create what is simply the most lifelike race driving simulator. So once you have beaten the single-player mode, your next step is to go online and beat as many human drivers as you can. If you get good enough, you might very well just attract the attention of a real-world team and get recruited into a real-world racing league. And yes, entire documentaries have been made about this very thing. And most other pro racing series try to follow in this series' footsteps, whether that's Forza Motorsport, Assetto Corsa, Project Cars, or iRacing. As such, all of these games are infinitely replayable so long as there continue to be humans to challenge to races, which, ironically, makes it a bit boring to talk about. The only subversion we can think of is the Grid series, which has always been more of a sim-lite, with more arcade game feel and storylines that push the envelope of what pro racing is supposed to be. Grid is special because it's about telling specific stories. It's something we'll talk about in future explorations of Grid, though that is for another day. The final major category of racing game is that of the battle racer. And yes, while Madeline has, in the past, classified Rivals as being one such title, that is not what we're talking about here. The extremes that we're going to for this category would be the likes of Burnout and Split Second. Burnout has always been a game where it is not enough to simply win races. You must also crash your opponents into whatever walls, barricades, or other vehicles happen to be in the immediate vicinity. Once you've beaten all of the game's events, your post-game is essentially going back and continuing to cause as much carnage as possible, just because you can. Though, Burnout Paradise at least had an online mode where you could perform cooperative challenges alongside other players. Alternately, you could just go into other people's servers and antagonize the hell out of them. Criterion eventually added a cops and robbers mode to this game, and it is believed that mode was essentially the precursor for what would eventually become NFS Hot Pursuit 2010. Split Second, meanwhile, is an altogether different affair. Rather than you crashing other drivers, your goal is to instead blow up the surrounding environment and hope that the wreckage itself is what does in your opponents. It was an ambitious game published by Disney, of all companies, but unfortunately, its post-game was rather limited to a very bare-bones PvP experience. And those were some of the main racing games that you'd be familiar with prior to the advent of the modern racing era, an era which began around the year 2014 with the introduction of the Xbox One and PlayStation 4. The modern era of racing games is very different from the era which came before it, and that is for better or for worse. To get one thing out of the way, pro racing games are generally the same as they've always been, so we needn't spend too much time talking about them. Battle racing games, meanwhile, have essentially fallen out of favor. Sure, you have a game like Wreckfest, but according to Steam charts, that game sees maybe 500 players on the average day. So then, the category we are really here to talk about is open world racing, which has become the primary category among players of the racing genre. How are those particular games holding up? I suppose it's appropriate to start off, once again, with Need for Speed. Unfortunately, I've got some bad news on that front. Electronic Arts, in their infinite wisdom, elected to maintain the status quo until it ultimately became their undoing. Between 2015, Payback, Heat, and Unbound, you had the same cookie-cutter experience adopted from the likes of Underground, Most Wanted, Carbon, and Undercover. The problem with that was that it became uninspired. The police were systemically worse, the locations were nothing to write home about, and while Unbound did have a separate MMO-style online mode, support for that mode has already ended because the developers have since moved on to other projects. For all any of us know, Need for Speed as a series is finished, and things are not much better on the sanctioned racing side. The newest Forza Motorsport was a complete disaster for Microsoft, while the Forza Horizon series has devolved into a state of blandness and gimmicks. Y'all know already how much Madeline hates that series, so best not to mince words about it. Yet, after all is said and done, we are ultimately brought back here to The Crew as a series. The original game in the series, may it rest in peace, had a traditional street racing story, but once that story was over, there were still a million things to do within that game's world. You had the PvP, the weekly tournaments, the monthly faction wars, you had over 70 vehicles to customize, and most of all, you had the entire continental United States to drive around in. The thrill of that game's post-game was in going from city to city, seeing all of the environmental diversity, and getting lost in the experience of driving a car, whether by yourself or with friends, if you had any. Meanwhile, the Crew 2. While it took some things away, it at least added more roads to drive on, a few new locations, and increased the number of vehicles from 70 to almost 700. So, no, you don't need to play this game for its mid-tier racing, but it is still a game that earns hundreds of hours just by being a fun driving experience, which I would say has to count for something. And I think, having spent the past 2 months on the island of Oahu in the Crew Motorfest, it maintains a lot of that driving integrity, despite being much smaller of a location. Given how the Maui expansion doubled the drivable area, that game could only get better if, during year 3, they added in something like Alaska, or even went as far as to redesign the US map and import it into the game. That one may be a bit of a stretch because it would more than double the game's storage size, though in an era where some games are nearly half a terabyte, well, maybe it's for the best. Well, I have certainly talked your ears off for quite some time, and on my end, it has now been approximately 30 minutes. We have traveled a long way, approximately 35 kilometers or 21 miles, yet somehow we are almost back to where we started. Our journey began at the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, before going through the Central Valley, around and then up into Mendocino, below the Golden Gate Bridge, and now we're crossing into the communities of Bodega Bay and Eureka. While the game places these two towns close together, in reality, they are almost 4 hours apart. Just imagine if this game was at a 1-to-1 scale. Our NPC driver has stayed around 40 miles per hour for most of the way, occasionally speeding up or slowing down as needed. More than that, did anybody notice the NPC has only been making right turns this entire time? We even made a full circle just to go left along one particular stretch of road we passed miles earlier, when a left turn would have saved a lot more time. And aside from that sudden stop around the halfway point, this journey has been surprisingly chill. This NPC seems content to roam around Eureka for a bit, but I am wondering if they do have an eventual destination in mind. I suppose that we will just have to keep following along and see what happens. And seeing as the current journey has been limited to California, we could talk a bit about Madeline's own experiences in the Golden State. I mean, she probably won't mind. Madeline has lived in California for the overwhelming majority of her own life, save for 1 year where she was attending university in Southern Oregon. And yet, there are parts of the state that not even she has seen. In her childhood, she occasionally took trips to Sacramento and San Francisco, either with family or for school trips. But it wasn't until she was in high school that she had the freedom to branch out. She went to the Humboldt Redwood Coast during her sophomore year, and she drove with her father to Los Angeles in her junior year. In her 20s, she got to explore more places, such as the San Joaquin Valley and San Luis Obispo. But it wasn't until a few weeks ago that she visited the Clear Lake, Ukiah area for the first time. She loved it down there, though she doesn't know if she'd want to live there or not. I believe that the only places she hasn't been to within the Golden State would be the southern Sierras of Yosemite and Kings Canyon, the city of San Diego, and the lower Mojave bordering Mexico. And I suppose the Big Sur State Park also, because that's just such an out-of-the-way destination. Most people don't realize it, but California really is that big, to an extent that people keep trying to split it into pieces, only to fail every time. Of course, that ain't none of my business, is it? Did that NPC just go through a street lamp? Something tells me that isn't supposed to happen. Oh, frick me. Yeah, I think we did a mischief. Are you good, bro? Need me to call AAA? I mean, I did say this was a bad idea. I should probably go. Thank you so much for watching, and please, don't try this at home. Until next time.